Tunnel vision is one of the biggest reasons strong blitz players throw away winning positions. We get attached to an idea, an attack, a weakness, a tactical motif, and eventually we stop asking the most important question in chess: what is my opponent doing? Today, I've got 3 games that all show tunnel vision in different forms. In one, a player becomes obsessed with attacking. In another, a winning side becomes fixated on delivering mate. And in the last example, a player locks onto a weakness so hard that they forget the rest of the board exists. Let's start with Game 1. This is a typical opposite-side castling dragon Sicilian position after white's last move h5, which means both sides are basically racing to see who can checkmate the other first. Black finds the right moment with b4. That's an excellent move. In these positions, you often have to trust your attack and strike before white's kingside play becomes too dangerous. White continues with h takes g6, opening the h-file. Taking on b4 wasn't really attractive because after a takes b4, rook takes b4, black gets the rook into the attack, opens the b-file, queen a5 to a2 ideas become extremely dangerous, and white can't comfortably take the rook because of queen takes c2 check. Black responds with b takes a3, which is playable, but this is where their mindset starts to drift. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the simple recapture h takes g6. Black already has excellent attacking chances and doesn't need to force matters. White plays b3 as they are kind of forced to defend the b-file. Otherwise, ideas like rook takes b2 check, followed by rook b8 and heavy pressure down the file become overwhelming. White could also have inserted b takes h7 check first, but the point remains the same. Now comes bishop takes b3. Not a bad sacrifice, but it once again feels a bit unnecessary. Black already has a great attack, so why commit to a bishop sacrifice immediately when h takes g6 keeps all options open? Black could have taken on g6 first and only then decided whether to sacrifice on b3, play a5 to a4, or whatever else. There's no reason to take extra risks when you're already doing so well. After c takes b3, rook takes b3 check, black gets the rook into the game exactly as intended. But then comes the critical moment. White steps away from the check, and black plays rook takes f3. This is where tunnel vision really takes over. For the 3rd time, black ignores the g6 pawn. Once again, simply playing h takes g6 was much cleaner. Instead, black becomes completely fixated on attacking. Sure, rook takes f3 wins a pawn and threatens knight takes e4, but it also completely neglects white's attack. Black seems to have convinced themselves that because they're attacking, they have to keep making offensive moves, regardless of what white is doing. White immediately takes advantage with g takes f7 check. Now that the pawn survives, black's king becomes exposed and the light squares start to matter a lot. And because black already sacrificed the light-squared bishop, those weaknesses become even more pronounced. Black eventually won the game anyway, but only because they got really lucky later on. The lesson is that black already had enough. They didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They didn't need to sacrifice more material or keep finding forcing moves. They simply needed to stop, acknowledge white's counterplay, and take the pawn on g6. Game 2 is almost the opposite story. After king b1, white is actually completely winning despite being down a queen. They have 2 rooks, a knight, and a pawn for it, and black's king is stuck on the back rank. White's immediate idea is knight e6 check, which is both a fork and potentially mating. Black stops it with queen g4, controlling e6. Now white has to reorganize. Instead, white starts becoming obsessed with delivering mate immediately. Rook f1 check isn't bad, it forces the king to a more cornered position. But after king g8, white already seems frustrated that there isn't a direct knockout. They play rook df7. Again, not a terrible move, but white still doesn't actually threaten anything concrete. There was a much stronger continuation here, knight e8. Yeah, apparently the rook doesn't actually have to move. Black can't take it because of knight f6 check, and white's knight is simply crashing into f6 with decisive threats. Instead, after queen c4, black's queen keeps finding these annoying defensive squares. On c4, it keeps an eye on white's rooks, limits their mobility, and white's knight on g7 can't quite join the attack. White plays b3, chasing the queen. Black responds with queen e2, once again finding the most irritating square possible, still eyeing the rook on f1. And this is where tunnel vision really kicks in. White's thought process must have been, my rooks are already on the f-file, the rook on f7 can't move, the attack has to continue, therefore the winning move must involve the knight. Both knight e8 and knight h5 hang the knight, so the only move must be knight f5. And that's exactly what white plays, knight f5. Except it loses the game. White's idea must have been that if black takes the rook on f7, then knight g3 check wins the queen. But the rooks weren't connected just because the rook on f7 needed protection. The rook on f1 needed protection too. The rooks were doing an excellent job defending each other, and knight f5 disconnects them. Black can simply take on f1 with check and then take the other rook as well. White essentially blundered two rooks with one move. The really instructive part is what white should have done instead. Rook 7 f2 was the engine's suggestion. And I love this move, not because it's the only winning move, but because it teaches such an important lesson. When you're materially ahead and dominating, backward moves often don't fall into your radar at all. But the rook on f7 wasn't actually accomplishing very much. In fact, it was actively getting in white's own way. By bringing it back to f2, white attacks the queen, improves coordination, and prepares knight f5 under much better circumstances. And white's overall idea was correct. Activating the knight was in fact the key. They simply tried to do it in the wrong order because they became too focused on delivering mate as soon as possible. And that's tunnel vision. Game 3 is perhaps the clearest example. Right now, white is doing fantastically. They have a strong center, plenty of space, and black's king has very few defenders. The weakness on g6 is real. But white allows that pawn to become their entire universe. They play rook h-g1. This move is completely aimed at g6, but it ignores black's counterplay. Much stronger was rook a-g1, as the rook on a1 wasn't doing anything anyway, and this keeps control of the h-file. Black correctly reacts with rook h8. They understand that white moved a defender away, so they immediately look for counterplay. The threat is rook h2 check. And now white gets carried away. f5. White keeps pushing their own agenda and ignores what black wants. Instead, I really like rook g2. Just stop rook h2 check. Simple. Then white can play f5, e5, double rooks, do whatever they want. Another attractive idea was e5, opening lines for the queen. If the queen lands on g6, that's far more dangerous than a rook arriving there. Even knight b3 instead would have been quite playable. But white wasn't thinking about any of these moves. They were thinking about g6. Black follows through with rook h2 check, and white makes one final mistake with king f1. This hangs the knight on d2. White must have believed that once they take on g6, it would somehow automatically lead to checkmate, which is simply not true. What white needed was to take a deep breath and play a defensive move, as in rook g2. Exchange the rooks, neutralize the counterplay. Instead, white was too emotionally invested in attacking g6. After queen takes d2, black wins the knight and offers queen trades. White finally gets rook takes g6 check. They achieved their dream, they captured the pawn, they gave check. But what did they actually accomplish? Almost nothing. Black can simply play king f7. After queen b3 check, king f8, black just steps aside. The attack is over. There is no mate. There is no breakthrough. If anything, it's white who has to defend their king. What's fascinating about this example is that white's initial evaluation was 100% correct. g6 really was a real weakness. That was not the mistake. The mistake was becoming so attached to exploiting that weakness that they ignored everything else happening in the position. Tunnel vision doesn't usually come from bad ideas. It comes from formerly good ideas that we refuse to let go of. And that's what makes this mindset so dangerous. In all three games, the players actually understood the position. Black in Game 1 understood they had an attack. White in Game 2 understood they needed to get the knight involved. White in Game 3 understood that G6 was weak. But understanding a position isn't enough. You also need the flexibility to change plans when the position changes. So next time you're attacking, or pursuing a weakness, or hunting for mate, ask yourself one simple question. Am I playing this exact position on the board? Or am I playing the idea I had 3 moves ago? Because in Blitz especially, tunnel vision isn't usually about missing tactics. It's about becoming so convinced you're right that you stop looking for reasons why you might be wrong.